Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan. It is good to be back. We're here answering your questions, a lot of questions from our wonderful supporters today, so we're going to dive right into answering those. But firstly, it's good to be back from the land of the rising sun. I'm back here in the American Empire in the great state of Texas. It's good to be home. It's good to be back on the microphone talking to you, Dmitry. Y'all had a great show with GSP. I was thrilled to listen to that. For the first time, I felt like I could listen to World War Now without, having any involvement. I felt like a real audience member. So that was all well and good. Some of you may be noticing the new artwork. This is our new Q&A art. I hope everybody likes it. I'm also thinking that for the Q&As, we may have some new intro music. So if you can think of any music or songs or beats or anything you think would kind of fit the brand of Aether Hour and World War Now for the Q&As, don't hesitate to drop a link below. We're maybe thinking about having a third intro because we like, being creative here and everything. But Dmitry, it's good to be back. How are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. I'm always excited for these Q&A episodes because you never know what kind of questions the audience and the viewers, our supporters mainly, will prepare for us. And this time around, in this first week of June, we have so many exciting questions. I mean, where do we even start here? But yeah, of course, it's good to have you back. And there's a few questions about Japan, actually, so I'll be very interested to hear about your experiences and some much deeper questions about just World War Now lore and geopolitics as well. So quite excited to have all of that available, and I think our listeners will really enjoy this one.
Yeah, we're gonna, as usual, these Q&As and Ether Hours, there's always a bit of World War Now updates in every episode, so you can't just tune into the weekly shows to get all the lore. So we know that our real tried and true supporters, they listen to these, they listen to Ether Hour, they listen to World War Now. So thank you again for your support. And with all of that, we're gonna dive right into your questions here. I think we're gonna start off in very World War Now style with a question from Vladimir B here. He asks, where are we on the timeline of World War III? I assume it has gone from Cold War to a warm war. When and what will be the likely triggers to go to a hot war? I note the Russian red lines have continually been crossed by USA and NATO, and that's a pretty good description, Vladimir. I think, Cold War to warm war has been sort of the past decade, really, of American foreign policy, definitely the past 4 or 5 years. And of course, obviously, the US's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine is really an explicit proxy war that the US is fighting against Russia. But I think we've made it fairly explicit on the show. I know maybe we should do an episode where we dive right into this analysis so that people can hear it right at the beginning of the episode. But I think the catalyst is going to be the fall of Erdogan in Turkey and also the ultimate replacement of Vladimir Putin by whoever his successor is in Russia. We believe will be a pretty big turning point in the global world wars. We believe it will cement Russia's understanding of itself as this cataconic Christian empire, as opposed to Putin's vision right now, which is, a sort of Russian nationalism that embraces multipolarity but seeks rapprochement with the West at the end of the day. I think some of the big catalysts obviously are going to be when Erdogan falls and then Turkey and Greece begin to escalate. I believe the Caucasus front is very relevant to this. Turkey's pushes in the direction of Armenia as well as into Syria and Iraq. Azerbaijan's war with Iran, basically, or their Cold War with Iran as they support Israel. We believe that is going to be probably one of the most important and relevant fronts in escalating the current, underlying Third World War, as Metropolitan Neofito says, into something that, the headlines are going to be explicitly talking about. And this will go down in the history books as World War III. When that starts, I think, again, Erdogan is going to be one of the key factors to that. But the US and France and these Western powers seeming more willing to openly discuss sending military trainers, sending troops, more and more equipment like F-16s to Ukraine, and then, of course, the situation in Israel, that is all extremely relevant. Ultimately, it may very well be the Iranian situation with Al-Aqsa, as well as Hezbollah, that goads the US into war with Iran, that then after that kind of opens up the door to World War III being publicly discussed, Erdogan falls, and then we see it expand into the Ukraine-Russia front and all of the fronts we talk about: China, Taiwan, the Caucasus, Israel, Palestine, Iran, the axis of resistance, the Houthis, of course, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics. All of these will merge into one, and it will be a truly world war, more so a world war than even the first and second, just by factoring in China and Taiwan, and then we're not even talking about anything going on in North America. So, we could go on about this for hours. That's what World War Now is for, right? But I think those are some of the key nodes, specifically the fall of Erdogan, specifically the collapse of Al-Aqsa Mosque and some of this Third Temple stuff. And then, of course, ultimately Putin's replacement and the cementing of Russia as this anti-Antichrist force.
Absolutely, I agree. The only thing I maybe would add is that unlike World War II, which primarily had two main battlefronts, which, I mean, you could count the Middle East and North Africa, but primarily it was, of course, Europe and the Pacific War involving the United States and its massive navy at the time, which it developed and constructed almost, right before the war itself. But in this particular conflict, you'll definitely have a Pacific war front. We can see that developing now with Taiwan, China, as you mentioned, Conrad, and the Philippines as well, and all these various, you can say, US satellite states, militarily speaking, as well as the North Korea, South Korea conflict, which essentially has been put on hold for a little while now. But I think Kim Jong un is preparing, as well as South Korea's frankly speaking, cultural degeneracy. I think the Koreans are preparing for something as soon as the floodgates of conflict are open in that particular region to, unfortunately resume sort of hostility, shall we say. And of course, on the European end, we can see Germany, again, increasing its military budget. Poland, of course, just, rearming its troops. Poland, of course, hasn't announced the mobilization yet, which is showing you that we are a few months, if not years, perhaps removed from a full-on hot conflict in Europe at this point. But we can see in the UK, they're speaking about, adding mandatory draft sort of conscription training for young people, who reach the age of 18, similar to how similar to what they would do in Russia and Eastern Europe. So that's very telling. I think the elites in these countries, the economic as well as cultural elites, are seeing where the wind is blowing and they're following along. And of course, in the Middle East, since the Trump presidency, we've seen hostilities towards Iran develop, and definitely that axis of resistance against Israel will be another battlefront. And you can see the US's fleet spread out across all these various seas and oceans. It'll be heavily involved, I think, in this coming conflict. And yes, of course, Russia, Erdogan, Putin, very important figures. These two are essentially these modern day, you could say, postmodern restrainers of something, because neither of these figures is perfect, but in fact somehow their position on the chessboard will essentially therefore will cause a chain reaction, a domino effect in geopolitics and international relations, which I think may even go out of the control of the elites who currently even set them into these positions themselves. I'm looking at Yeltsin, who put Putin into his position of power, sort of Putin coming from these questionable circles of St. Petersburg, and Erdogan, I'm sure, has very similar origins from the deepest parts of Turkish politics. So I agree with your analysis, Conrad, here.
Yeah, before we move on to this next question, because we actually have a lot, it's very true that there are the very real politique things going on the ground that I think we're going to be totally vindicated on within anything from a 2 to 5 year time frame. So I think these are real predictions, and there's going to be, I think, at our level, an uptick in audience, and then more people paying attention to some of these prophecies because of what's about to occur. But then there is, of course, the very much supernatural and some would say outlandish elements. And everybody should listen to our episode with Gregory Hears on St. John Vatatzis. And we're going to have the part 2 to that about the prophecies coming up here at the end of June. So everybody look forward to that. This is still in the free segment. So if you're questioning about getting behind the paywall, obviously you want to hear the rest of this Q&A, but you'll also get the next John Vatatzis episode and all 40 plus of our amazing Aether Hours in full, which are, some say it's some of the best content on the internet. I'm not saying it, but, others are saying it. So be sure to get behind the paywall and support the show. But yeah, moving on to this next question. This is from Walter. The question is, Japan and Orthodoxy, what do you envision for the future? And what was your experience with Japanese Christians? And I was going to tie in a question from Seraphim in the same vein. He says, I have a trip to Japan planned in the next few months. What would you say are your top 3 to 5 recommendations to see or do? So I'll just talk a bit about my experience in Japan. It was a great time. It's a beautiful country, obviously. As America, specifically the urban areas in Western Europe, sort of deteriorate, it was very nice to go to somewhere like Tokyo and Osaka, metropolitan areas with 40 plus million people, the most densely populated, largest city in the entire world. Yet it's clean. There's no people on drugs running around. At least there's not a lot of visible crime. public transport is lovely. There's no people playing music on these speakers and whatnot. It's a very peaceful and easy to navigate place, and the people there are very respectful. I received nothing but help and love from the Japanese people. A lady saw me struggling with a vending machine and just paid for my cheap water and everything. The dollar is very good right now, so your dollars go a long way with Japanese yen. So take note of that. Don't be afraid to shop. You'll be getting good value. I know people like to resell and whatnot. I'm not super into that scene, but I definitely got some cool clothes and some cool things for a lot cheaper than you could find in the United States. But as far as Orthodoxy goes, I definitely had a positive experience. In Tokyo, I was able to go to the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, the Japanese Orthodox Church, get a blessing from Metropolitan Seraphim, who, seems like a very serious hierarch. He was much beloved by, the altar servers and all the people there. There are a lot of Russians and even Western diaspora Orthodox there, but ultimately most of the clergy and a lot of the people there are ethnic Japanese, as is the Metropolitan himself. I was able to get an icon of St. Nicholas and a few things from the cathedral. And then at my second time in Tokyo, on my way back after visiting other parts of the country, I was able to visit the grave of St. Nicholas, who, he's able to be buried properly in an Orthodox way, despite the fact that in Japan, technically you legally need to be cremated. So you go to these big cemeteries and everybody's there. It's either their ashes or it's sort of just a memorial plaque with a little monument. But this area was gated off and it had St. Nicholas and the other bishops that have been buried. So not many people, but it's a very interesting thing. It's about 25 minutes by subway from the cathedral. So I recommend doing those two things for sure, going to a service at the cathedral and then seeing the grave. But as far as, things that you should just do regardless, I definitely recommend going to the Hakone region. It's a bit more rural. It's near Mount Fuji and it's known for hot springs. It's a very beautiful area that has these sort of hotel resort things that have the hot springs incorporated into these bathhouses. I definitely recommend that. I, of course, recommend going to some smaller places like Kyoto, Kanazawa, seeing the more authentic samurai, Shinto, towns and city blocks and temples and whatnot. And of course, the Buddhist and Shinto, temples and shrines respectively are fascinating and beautiful. But the only one comment I wanted to make for everybody is Japan is still very much a pre-Christian society. Like between Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Protestantism, it's like less than 2% of the population are even in any meaningful way Christian. So as much as these people are very enculturated and have values and whatnot, there's just no way you could describe them as a religious people. You could perhaps describe them as a spiritual people, but they're very much pre-Christian in the sense that ideas of religious exclusivity, ideas of religion being the main source of even moral values in a lot of ways, that's not there in the society. The homogeneity and the fact that it's still a country full of Japanese people by and for Japanese people, the demographic realities of the West, as well as even some of the, white guilt ideas and whatnot about being anti-cultural chauvinism, those haven't been baked in as deeply. So they still have a civilization going and have customs and things withheld, despite the fact that religion is not quite there the same way that even in societies that are less unified, the reality of, Christian moral values is there. And it's not that they're less moral people than us, it's just that it's clear that they don't just need to be taught orthodoxy in the correct form of Christianity. They need to be taught why the cross was important, why the resurrection was important for the restoration of humanity. They need to understand these sorts of things at a fundamental level before we can even, liturgize them and enculturate them into an Orthodox society, which, thanks to St. Nicholas and the Orthodox Church, it's already there. The services are in Japanese, and it's very much, the soil is ready for these seeds to be planted. And I think Orthodoxy is going to grow in Japan, if any Christianity is. But people should be aware of that it's very different how they handle, morality and public religion. But Dmitry, I know you've been to Japan, so I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, no, of course, your experiences almost directly reflect mine, Conrad. And yeah, I just wanted to add the Orthodox Church of Japan, like places to visit would, of course, be the cathedral in Tokyo. That's just like a must visit. And of course, the Yanaka graveyard, which is just about half an hour away north by, by train, where you can see the tomb, the sarcophagus, and the resting place of Saint Nicholas of Japan. I think that's really important. Those two places, and I mean, one of the stories from World War II was, as you guys can imagine, the firebombing by the U.S. of Tokyo was so extreme that even I believe the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was burnt down. So a lot of the esteemed suburbs were completely destroyed. So Tokyo today is very much different to what it was pre-World War II. But interestingly enough, the Orthodox suburbs around the cathedral, as well as the Yanaka graveyard where the relics of St. Nicholas rested, were almost, you could say, spiritually shielded from the firebombing, and the fire just simply didn't touch these suburbs. And so Yanaka graveyard, where the relics rest, is actually one of the more historical Tokyo suburbs. As you probably saw, Conrad, the houses there are really old, and even the roofs, like, it literally looks like you're in some medieval The Last Samurai, like Tom Cruise type of setting. Really cool, similar to Kyoto and some of the Osaka places. So it's just extremely fascinating. I would recommend going to those places. But of course, Japan is, there's as much to see, sort of spiritually speaking, some of those Orthodox sites but the secular experience is just as amazing, because you are witnessing you can say, modernity at its peak, if you can say that. I'm not sure if modernity and the modern human development in its sort of secular, non-Christian phase can get any better than Japan at this point. It is a fascinating and a very safe society. It's worth visiting at the moment, right? I would say before things sort of get worse in the world, especially before they start bringing in migrants, shall we say. But yeah, fascinating experience, Conrad. I think we'd love to hear more. We could almost have an entire Aether Hour dedicated to Japan and that country in particular. It's just so amazing.
It's quite a beautiful country, and I definitely recommend anybody, visit it before you die. Go to the top of the Tokyo Sky Tree, one of the tallest structures in the world. Go see Mount Fuji. That was probably my biggest regret, was due to weather. I wasn't able to get the best view of Mount Fuji and all of these other things. But, I think everybody should go and experience the land of the rising sun. It truly is the land of the rising sun. The sun goes up so early there. It's crazy. It's like 4 a.m. and the sun is already up. So be prepared for that. But moving on here, we have a question from Nicholas Alexander. He says, "Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this Q&A, everybody. This might have been the most questions we've ever had, so get behind that paywall and listen to some of the best questions we've got, frankly. We talk a lot about Khazaria, give some clarifications about Dmitry's article. We talk about things going on in the US and other diaspora areas. We talk about monarchs outside of Russia, British monarchs and whatnot. So get behind the paywall, support the show. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you on the other side. God bless."